Morning, everybody from the garden. It is late September, and I know a lot of you have been following our garden updates this season, this from spring planting until growth and harvest time. And we still have a few things that are growing that are beautiful. We have some things that are done, and we have some things that are in the process that we need to clean up. When you have a garden, there is always something to do. And there is a season for everything. It's just like in Ecclesiastes that says that to everything there's a season and there's a time for every purpose under heaven. And we can apply that to our spiritual walk and growth in the Lord and life in the Lord as well, and ministry. There's always something God can teach you through His beautiful creation. And for instance, this marigold plant was planted from one little tiny seed. And it is abounding in blooms, and it is still blessing me daily with beauty. And I love to share these beautiful things with you guys because I know you get a lot of enjoyment out of them. You see the deadness here, that's starting to fade. So if I come in and clip these off, the more I remove what is getting past its season, its bloom, its beauty, the more I clip those off, the more this has come back and flourished. So what you're looking at is a result of constant pruning and attention to this plant. Not that I've done it, but I have worked on it. God has, God does all of this. But if you work more at it and give it more attention, you will get more of a good result, I suppose I'm trying to say. Just like with anything, if you put something into it, you will get more out of it. And a lot of times, and I've done some research on some of my plants that I've planted. If you just plant things and you just think, well, it's going to do its thing because it's a plant and it'll just do what it's supposed to do. But if you take time to learn about each plant, is so different. God has beautifully, intricately designed everything so different. And if you just take a little time to see what makes it flourish a little bit more and how you can help it. I had a friend that had some tomatoes that was having some issues. It was having like blossom end rot on the bottom of it. And so we started trying to figure out what was causing that. And if you'll take the time to learn about what causes it, you can rectify it a lot of times and save any tomatoes or plants, depending on what you're growing and learning about, an issue you're having. Sometimes you can save it. So as you can see here, it's constant work, and I'm out here a lot pruning these, but see, there's every day more start to fade, so there's more work to be done. And sometimes it gets ahead of you, and certain things have gotten ahead of me right now. But this plant here, this was the Holy Land tomato, and this was the original plant that I bought, paid $1 for. You, some of you see the beautiful tomatoes I got from it. This plant had completely, except for the green main stems here that you see. The leaves that were on it had turned brown and crispy and were drooping, and there was no life in them. And there was a few small tomatoes left on it. So I thought, I'm taking off all the dead, and I'm going to leave the vines, the branches here, I'm going to leave them, and I'm going to see, because if you've got something dead on your plant and you leave it, it's taking away energy from your plant. Your plant is drawing nourishment from the roots coming up. It's going into that deadness, and there's nothing that's going to produce from that. So you have to cut the dead off. My intention was that the tomatoes that was still on the vine, the small ones, I was hoping they would get bigger. They didn't really get bigger. They did ripen a little bit. I went ahead and pulled them off green. And I thought, okay, well, since the vines were still green, I just left them. I thought, at the end of the season, I'm just going to pull it up, and, put it in the dead pile. But I left it. And as you can see, everything that was dead because I cut the dead away. You know, there's a little end right there that's still a little brown. But see, those vines are still so green. But look here, every leaf that you see, every leaf that you see there that has sprouted back up, every one of those are brand new. It is because this plant now can put its energy forth into producing new life. And I have blooms. And if the weather holds out, who knows, I may get some more tomatoes. Now this one right here, this is another good example. This one right here was a sucker that I pruned off, and I put it in a little pot, and it was just a tiny little thing. It came off of this one. It was just a tiny little thing. And I transplanted it just last week, and it's probably grown 6 inches, and it now has blooms also on it. Right there, it's got blooms. That might produce a tomato, it might not, but it sure has a chance. It's sure trying to do everything that it knows to do as a plant. This one over here, this tomato, this was all also a sucker that was pruned off of the original Holy Land tomato plant. And it was just about a 12 inch little stem that I cut off of the original plant. I found this sucker. Sometimes they can get away with you. You can prune them off one day. Suckers will grow right in the elbow of something. Like for instance, this little okra plant here, it's grown right off right there in that middle. So that would be kind of considered a sucker, but since this is producing okra, it's fine. But on a tomato plant, if you have a sucker like that, it can take energy from your plant. So you want to prune them off. But on this plant, I just actually took that stem and just stuck it right down in the ground, and watered it a little bit, and it started taking root and growing. So this plant now also has a bloom, and it has a potential to grow and bloom and make a tomato if the season and the weather last good enough. So as you see, I've still got things growing and blooming. I've got some beautiful snapdragons that are still blooming. This sunflower here, some of the blooms are faded, and some of the blooms are still trying to open. So on the heads that are dying, the birds are loving the seeds, and you can save the seeds for next year. Now sometimes when you plant something the year before, you might have something that comes up as a volunteer. I had a nasturtium plant. All these nasturtiums with the big leaves back there, those right there, those are all volunteers. And they came up, look at there. All that came up from last year. I didn't even have to plant them, but because of last year's labors, you know, they survived. They survived the winter. There was I don't know if you can see down in here, this tomato plant right there beside the bucket actually came up as a volunteer little cherry tomato. This is the one I intentionally planted in this pot this year from last year, because I called it my abundant cherry tomato because it produced so many blooms. But this little tomato right here, it's coming off of that volunteer, so I'm getting more fruits just from last year's labor that I hadn't intended on. Now over here is my bush beans. Now that's not pretty. That's going to have to be cleaned up. But there's still some beans, a few beans on the vine there that I can potentially get some seeds out of. I'm going to let those turn completely brown. I'm going to take these beans up out of the soil. But what I found out from dying bean vines, if the longer you leave them in the ground, it actually helps your soil. So I'm in no big hurry to clean this mess up, but it will have to be tended. It will have to be cleaned out so more can be planted next year. But right now, it's still helping the soil. Again, that's just some little something that I have learned that's going to help my garden next year. So this is a continuing thing that it's continuously learning. Now you can see here, I've got some peppers that are growing. So they're still flourishing here. They're still growing. All right, now we're going to go look at the trellis. Okay, so you're going to see here reality. What happens at the end of the season? We still have some things that are blooming and pretty. These Cosmos bright lights are wonderful, but see there, the bumblebee's still on there. These little flowers here are already spent. The more I come along and clip those off, the more this thing will come back and bloom. I spent probably an hour and a half last week trying to trim off the dead blooms, but it's bloomed so much that, like I said, it's constant work. There's so many there that still I need to come back and clip off. There's just constant work to be done. These sunflowers here, this was my Goldie Honey Bear, and they're drying up, and I've cut off some of the heads to dry out. Some of the heads I am hanging them on the trellis to dry out, and the birds think I have hung them there for them to eat off of, and they're such pretty little birds I can't hardly deny them. I have plenty of seeds. But as you can see, my bean vine, the trellis of my bean vine, see, I'm having to cut these off. They're dying, they're done. I'm going to have some seeds from them, but I've also had some enemies here that have eaten on these leaves. And these little enemies here have larvae that they are leaving behind, so I'm going to have to cut off all these dead leaves. I'm putting them in a bucket so that they can kind of die off, and then I'm going to take these completely away from my garden, probably take them to the dump, so that they're nowhere around next year, so nothing can hatch out. But it's going to take some work for me to, some of these leaves have fell into my soil, so I'm going to have to rake all those out down there. So it's a lot of work to be done so that my garden will be better protected next year from enemies. And it's just a constant work, you know, in our everyday life to protect ourselves from, we have an adversary that's like a roaring lion, the Bible says, and he's always seeking whom he may devour. So he's already plotting and planning how he can bring destruction. But so lots of work still to be done. I've started on it, but it's constant work. But look here, it's still their season. Looky there. I've still got some beauty here. I've still got some really beautiful things. I've still got butterflies and insects that's just loving this, just loving it, and I've still got new growth. So there's still things that are growing, and then there's still work to be done. It's a constant thing. Here's some new blooms. These zinnias are just beautiful. So I still have some Kentucky Wonder Beans that I planted last, and they're still growing. I have here a cantaloupe vine. I don't know if it's going to do anything or not. I still have watermelons. We will see how they do. I told you it's a learning process, and you know, up until 2 years ago, I didn't know how to grow anything. And so I just had to sort of learn, and I planted a few things at a time just to start learning about them. And I planted 4 stalks of corn in each of these little beds, and I got just a little corn. I showed you that the other day, but I didn't want to overdo it. If I planted too much, I mean, this is a lot of work. This is a daily thing, and as you see, there's still lots of work to be done. It's going to take time. But if you go too big when you're first learning, then you know your garden will suffer. So it's better to start little and learn a little at a time, and then grow. But looky there, how pretty. I've still got some of those pretty zinnias coming up. But as you can see, you know, some of these things are past their season. They're past their season, and some of those leaves have got to come down, and we've got to get those out of here. So anyway, this is just a little garden update. This is reality. This is what happens. But I'm already planning for next year's garden, so I have to do the work that's going to be necessary for it to flourish next year. But in the meantime, I'm still getting to enjoy the things that are still in season. So no matter what stage of life you're in or what's going on, the Lord will still give you some beauty and things to do, to tend, to enjoy, and to share. So, hope you've enjoyed this little garden update, and I'll talk to you soon.